radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark. We stand together and accept that we now live in a world transformed by Fukushima. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on UCY.TV radio. We relentlessly engage every ear that listens. We expose and confront the complete lack of accountability for the nuclear industry. Consider social engineering programs who view our bodies, minds, and souls as assets on a balance sheet. We discuss vital current issues, interview activists, and engage our audience in an effort to allow all voices to be heard. The Age of Fission radio show creates a venue that all will choose. We encourage our listeners to reclaim their power and their courage to take action and save our planet from the ravages of greed and indifference. Our actions matter. Every voice matters. We remind our listeners that happiness is resistance. Love is greater than fear. Good morning, UCY.TV radio listeners. This is Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission radio show. Today is July 11th, 2017. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you joining in every day, sharing our radio station with your friends and family, helping our station grow. It was great to hear Jules on the air this morning. Shout out to Jules. Glad that you are sounding a bit chipper again and back to your old self. Glad to hear you're going to be changing some of those negative habits. So welcome back to the real world, or, I don't know if this is the real world, but a portion of the real world. So today I had a guest lined up named Kai Huschke. We confirmed it last night. Something must have come up because this morning I could not get in touch with him. His phone kept ringing. So I have no idea what went on with Kai, but Kai is from CELDEF, which is the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, which I have been jumping up and down here about, talking about community rights. I was super excited to speak with him. We confirmed the interview and no answer. So I have no idea. I do hope that he'll come back. He won't be able to come back till after August. Between his schedule and mine, we just don't have the time. Hopefully I'll be speaking with him sometime today and we can get that one tidied up and figure out a time when he can come back. Or maybe I'll just have to pre-record because he's got a super busy schedule. I actually rescheduled Heidi Lambert, who was supposed to be on today, for Kai because he had such a tight schedule. So, oops. Anyways, thanks for joining us. That means you guys are lucky because if you want to call in, you can at 718-717-8106. And I'm just going to power forward sharing with you, ringing that bell again, the same two things, the community rights, and we've got to stop this bill. If you have not called your congressman, please do. We are talking about Bill H.R. 3053, the Nuclear Waste, what is the exact title? Nuclear Waste Policy Amendment Act of 2017, which, as you know, is going to take away our water rights from the federal government, from the state, and from the municipalities, folks, if this thing passes. They are going to supersede all of our rights and give it to corporations because you know how corporations love to take care of the planet. This is a super urgent bill because if we do not do that, we are going to be super screwed. And people that know water protectors or anybody out there fighting these oil pipelines, you better get them in on this because this actually affects that also. Because this nuclear waste takes away any environmental impact reports. The act takes away any environmental impact report requirements. It takes away congressional oversight. It takes away the necessity for analysis of transporting these half-thin canisters to see if they're even leaking. It won't even matter. It could be leaking down the road and leaking nuclear waste in your town headed for Utah, and you wouldn't even know about it. So this is HR 3053. Muy importante, folks. You've got to get your congresspeople to say, oh, I don't think so. I personally took the handout that Donna Gilmore wrote, and if you go to Donna Gilmore's page, santanofresafety.org, it's probably the best place to get a synopsis of it. The very first link, it says, reasons officials should oppose HR 3053 NWPA amendment. Just double click on that and it pops up a really great synopsis page. Yesterday morning, I spent a little bit of time looking up their fax numbers, and I faxed that page to 6 people, all of the 6 representatives in Oregon, the House representatives. I plan on doing that. Frankly, that's going to be my little part-time job. I'm just going to fax them the info, because if you're not their constituent, they don't really care. But the stuff that comes over, they're going to have someone picking that up off the fax is going to have to look at this information. And it is stunning. If you were to look at this handout, it would knock you off your socks. So, and for all you haters out there and all the people addicted to hate, and we know who we're talking to, the place where I refuse to go, it does matter what we do. It 100% matters what we do. Our thoughts are things, and which is why I reject your negativity, because our thoughts are things. If you think about negative things all the time and you talk about negative things all the time, that's what you're going to manifest. So stop barfing on me, would you please? We're going to overcome this because we have an obligation to do so. We have been intellectually lazy for about 50 years, just slathering ourselves up in butter, just rolling around like pigs in a barrel, feeling like we're the lucky Americans while we're destroying the planet. Those days are gone. The time for hard work, to put the boots on the ground, to actually make a difference, be positive thinkers. And I'm not talking about, the feel-good new age type of, let's only talk about positive thoughts. We have to think positively about a lot of negative things. There are a lot of negative things, and the reason those negative energies are able to override our positive thoughts is because there's a lot of people addicted to negativity. It's a lot easier to look under a rock and to live under the rock than to climb on top of the mountain. But once you get to the top of the mountain, you can see everything, and it's magnificent, and the air is clean, and everything is better. It's worth the journey. It's worth the climb. Ask any hiker. Ask anybody who's a mountaineer. So I refuse to do that. I mean, I've shared this with you before. I grew up in what was like a prison. So I didn't break free at 18 to just at the end of my life go, yeah, life's shit. That's the way it is. Too bad. Nothing matters. We're just going to die in 50 years anyways because they've been killing us. We are coming through some catastrophic changes. Seriously, bad changes. Because we've had about 150 years of absolute destruction of our environment. But their paradigm does not have to be our paradigm. Love is greater than fear. We can overcome it. This is the power of the human psyche. We have the possibility to rise up higher. It's up to us. Every single individual can choose to rise up to a higher realm. Every single person. And if you're addicted to negativity and you don't believe it's going to work, just attempt it. I mean, if all that beating yourself up did you any good, you'd be rich. You'd have everything that you wanted. It would actually work for you, but it doesn't work for you. Negativity only brings negativity. So I'm going to press on, and I'm going to be optimistic in the face of huge obstacles. Doesn't matter. There isn't much people can do to me anymore. I've had pretty much everything done. So I'm not stopping. And I'm not going to back down, and I'm going to believe in the power of love. Love is greater than fear. I believe on our planet, Gaia, our mission on this planet is love. Our mission in the universe is love. Every mammal on this planet feels love. I think that's been pretty well documented. So I'm going to move on, and I would still encourage people to please contact your House of Representatives official. And you know what? I like this idea. If even like 5 representatives got this Nuclear Waste Policy Amendment Act summary that Donna Gilmore took the time to read, digest, and put onto paper for us, and very well assembled, I might say. And at the bottom of the page, it even has her phone number, her email, and her website, and her name. So she owns it all. If you fax this in to all of these representatives, you know how easy it is to find their fax numbers? Type in fax number. All you have to do is go to the list of representatives, find their fax numbers. It's easy. Go to their web pages. You don't have to take 3 hours doing it every day, but you know what? A half an hour every day will definitely fill the pot, folks. It really does matter. And it is up to us. The reason we have the mess that we're in now is because everybody thought someone else was handling it. Everybody else thought that all these, I guess, I don't know what we call them. I call them establishment environmentalist people. Oh, here's Kai. Hold on just one second. Good morning. This is Lonnie Clark. Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission.
Is this Lonnie?
Yes. Is this Kai?
Yes.
Kai, welcome to the show. You're live on our show, the Age of Fission radio show. Thanks for calling.
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning. Wow, I'm super excited. I'm glad that you were able to connect with me. I was like, are you aware? I was just about lecturing my listeners about the bill HR 3053, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, Amendment Act of 2017. Are you aware of it?
I'm not.
Yeah, well, this is why I was telling them about it. Listen to this. And I mean, I'm going to ask you some questions, but listen to this, and I hope to turn you on to this one, because I'm telling everybody to call their House representatives and tell them to vote this Amendment Act down. It speaks about rights, preempts state, local water rights, water and air rights. It preempts federal water rights and other rights. It eliminates safety requirements critical for preventing radioactive leaks. It eliminates requirements for a permanent repository before contracting for consolidated interim storage facilities, which are now referred to as MRSs. Pays millions of dollars annually from a nuclear waste fund for permanent and interim waste facilities, even if no waste is ever stored there. Eliminates the requirements for monitored retrievable fuel storage in spite of calling it monitored retrievable storage agreements. Eliminates environmental impact reports, allows these facilities to store and transport existing thin wall casks without being inspected, maintained, or repaired. And it allows for these storage facilities no adequate plan to replace leaking canisters. Stunning, I know, huh? What really shocks me is this is going to eliminate our water rights. Federal water rights are going to be eliminated and given to corporations.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not the only industry where that's pretty much par for the course.
Yeah, well, I think we ought to stop it. I'm encouraged. Now, let me ask you this. So, Kai, let me just give you a proper introduction. This is Kai. How do we say your last name, Kai? Huschke?
It's pronounced Huschke.
Huschke. Okay, Kai Huschke from the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. I met Kai. He was one of my instructors. I went to the democracy school, and as you guys have known, since the day I went there, I came back here like jumping up and down about community rights. This is the thing. Does it really matter if we contact our elected representatives and put pressure on them to stop bills like this? I get a lot of negative feedback that it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a a tough situation, in a couple of different ways. I mean, obviously, it's you don't want to discourage people, paying attention to what their government is supposed to be undertaking on behalf of the people. So I think it's natural when these issues come up and what you just described, and the clear outrageousness of what its intention is, in the sense of doing really nothing to protect people and the environment, ignoring basic fundamental human rights where it comes to water, for instance. I think the next step, though, is then, well, fine, go ahead and do your bidding to try to stop it and see if the political influence can win out the day. The problem is we don't ever really go any further than that. We wait, or these moments come up, we mobilize, we try to do our best. If we win, we win. If we lose, and we go home. The next step needs to be to understand, why does this stuff come up in the first place? Don't we need to look more closely at how our system is actually put together as to why we even have to deal with these things at all? And I think that's really what the community rights work starts to go towards, which is saying, well, when we do start to dig deeper, we find out we have a system that's really predisposed in so many ways to have these kinds of policies move forward. And if they are enacted, actually to be upheld, because the system wants to entertain that kind of a bizarre value system over what we really want to see. And I think that's where the question then becomes, what value really are our legislators at really just about any level, when their job in so many ways is to uphold the current system. How do we actually expect them to really change course when they're not even asking the right questions? So I think that comes back to us then to start asking the right kinds of questions. And I think the way that we do it is to be smart in putting forward what the right questions are. And I think with that, it's really the realization that we have to step into the fray in a deeper level around actually becoming the lawmakers in our communities and in the state and eventually the federal level, because it's clear over time we see that our elected officials really aren't doing what they should be doing. And even if there are elected officials out there who are willing to do the good work, the problem is they have a system that's not programmed really to do what needs to get done. So it's a tough one, but I think overall, I think the expectation has to be that our elected officials really are in a position of which either they got the industry has their ear and they're going to do their bidding, or if they want to do something really in the manner which they should be doing, they're going to get stopped because the system's not really set up to do that. I think one of the interesting statistics that came out on a lengthy report a couple of years ago was really looking at federal policy over the last 30 years and trying to understand whether or not the average person really has any real say, any influence. And the conclusion was we don't. That it's really the powerful few and the industries that really are setting the course for things, and that our really influence, even through voting booths, is not even registering, at least at that federal level. And I think that should give very, very deep pause for people to say, well, perhaps our experiment of so-called American democracy really isn't working. And if we want democracy, well, we're going to have to make it.
Wasn't that highlighted, though, that the reason in the class that I took with you, part of why that didn't work is the way our structure was originally set up. It wasn't really set up to be a true democratic process, correct?
Yeah, and I think that's the digging piece. When you start to dig and start to ask yourself, why do things function the way they do? Why aren't we in our own communities able to be more self-governing? Why is it that corporate interests seem to just run roughshod? And you're right. I mean, when we start to look at least when the Second Constitution came into play and really its mission and its goals, it really snuffed out that ability to have really a truer democracy in the way that the revolutionary sentiment and the Declaration of Independence had put forward. The Second Constitution really is a very, it's a document in a lot of ways that's 180 degrees the other direction, which when you look at that, it's really about going back to that British form of government, that kind of anarchical way of decision making, and really, empowering the powerful few again. And of course, if we look at all the statistics out there about income distribution and wealth and who's making decisions and who owns industries, well, it's pretty clear about how that disparity is looking, and it gets that way because of the way that the fundamental system has been set up. So I think that's where the deeper digging comes into play, which is to say, if we want what we know we deserve, and we know we need to change course radically in so many different ways, whether environmentally or economically or civilly, well, part of that work is we're not going to find it within the system to a large degree, but we're going to have to actually build it because it's just not there. And I think that's probably the biggest thing and the hardest thing for people to wrap their heads around, that we're going to have to roll up our sleeves that much. But the good thing is there are people doing it, there's communities doing it, and there's progress being made. So it's not as if we're having to start completely from scratch here.
What do you mean by the Second Constitution?
Well, in the way that things had moved through that period of history, we went through the revolutionary period. We had the various, revolts happening, locally, and eventually through the whole collection of the colonies and their assertion through the Declaration of Independence. As that battle was being fought, folks got together and drafted up their new governing document for their new country, and that new document was the Articles of Confederation. So this was really the country's first constitution, where the different colonies came together and formed this firm league of friendship. The idea that there was a need for a coalition of sorts for certain matters, but that decision making was really down to not even really so much the states, but really the local communities empowering their states to make certain decisions, and those states saying, well, we want to keep our decentralized status, and that, again, we understand there's needs to come together more centralized for certain things. Well, that document only lasted, 8-9 years before this, what we know as the Constitution today, mm-hmm. which is really the second federal, governing document to come into play. And when you see how that was built and what it values, so much of it actually goes against what the Articles of Confederation was intending to do, and really goes against what the Declaration of Independence laid out in the sense of, inherent rights and self-determination, and really, the important piece of this empowerment of the people themselves as all source of political power, and that really there's this need that level of power needs to be at the very top, such that if government starts to go sideways, the people have a right and a responsibility really to alter and change government when that happens. Unfortunately, the way that the Second Constitution has built the government, it's very difficult to change course by the way that it's set up really a lot of features to be undemocratic. And that's, what we're contending with today. And it's that document itself also where corporations found their greatest powers, whether it's within the Bill of Rights itself or in the body of the Constitution. Corporations have found tremendous power by the way that document has been structured. And, a lot of its focus, putting the rights stuff aside for a second, a lot of its focus was really about commerce. How do you build a great nation, and how do you do it quickly and in a way that really protects those with the greatest amount of, investment in capital. And so that commercial orientation of the Constitution, and really tied to that, the hyper property protection. And I'm not talking about, personal property of one's house, for instance, but this idea of, of land and other things that have come to be known as property today. which of course that kind of property is owned by the powerful few. When you have a governing document that wants to make sure that that is the most well-protected elements of how the government is going to function, you begin to see why, basic human rights, as if, protecting water, for instance, start to get overridden by the commercial entrance of nuclear power production. So there's a direct example of what you brought up earlier of how that commercial interest of feeding the grid takes precedence over what, an everyday person would say is a ridiculous notion to sacrifice, one's water. But that's the craziness of how that government document is set up. And then, of course, all the other laws and court rulings that come with it. You start to see this sort of, giant rat's nest of a reality that we're a part of. But, I think there's an awareness and awakening that we have to get out from underneath of. But what hasn't happened in mass yet is the understanding that we really have to revolt against that, not think we can reform it, which then also comes to understanding that there's probably a limited ability of elected officials as they stand today to really do our bidding for us. Because if you look historically, there have been moments of which elected officials have taken that final big step on behalf of all the people's efforts coming prior to that. But that moment didn't happen until the people actually made tremendous progress for then elected officials to be able to take that step, because they knew that that was the only direction they could go, because the political force of the people is that powerful. I don't think we're there yet. There's some churning, there's some stirring, but we haven't gotten as focused as we need to be yet. We haven't built the apparatus, that movement apparatus yet, to really hold elected officials' feet to the fire, or better yet, replace them and put our people in office to do the bidding of truly what the people need, and not just, every 4 years be mesmerized by the parties themselves. We've got to build basically a different political landscape for ourselves. And, the interesting thing, I suppose, coming out of the presidential election of last year was, I think, the first time that I've seen people really start to entertain perhaps a different political landscape. The question is, can we get there? And hopefully we do. But I think, again, those are all good signs. We're just not there yet.
Okay, so when you say revolt, we have to revolt. I mean, most people look at that as like a violent thing. Are you advocating like overthrowing the government, or what do you mean by that?
Well, I think the best way to give it context is what's happening in the community rights frame, for instance. So you have communities that are being subjected to corporate harms, clear corporate harms. They are being used as sacrifice zones, whether it's toxic waste incinerators moving in, whether it's, the industrial agriculture industry setting up, large factory farms, whether it's the fossil fuel industry, using communities for resource extraction for natural gas or oil, or using those, using those communities to dump the toxic wastewater into. This stuff is happening every day, everywhere. And there are communities who, of course, have been trying to fight it within the system that it is. But of course, the system is predisposed to allow that stuff to happen, to legalize it. But you're starting to have communities that basically are revolting against the system that says you're going to get this whether you like it or not. And there are people saying, well, hell no, we're not going to get it. And we don't care what the system may say in the sense of conventional legal doctrines that say, well, your community is preempted by the federal government, or your community is preempted by corporate rights. Communities are saying, well, if we allow that to happen, we are basically just sacrificing not only ourselves, but future generations as well as the environment itself. And in our good conscience, we can't allow that to happen. That our system in that manner is unjust and illegitimate, and we are going to actually revolt against it, in the sense that we are going to put forward a different form of governance in our communities that actually respects and recognizes basic rights. And we're going to reject the notion that we're going to be overridden by corporations or even higher levels of government that are going to try to stuff this stuff down our throats. And so that's the revolt element that is beginning to happen, which, interestingly enough, begins to set sort of, the stepping stones for what can happen at the next levels, meaning the state and the federal level. So it's not an advocation of armed uprisings, but it is, an understanding that if we're going to actually stop the bad stuff and try to start instituting the good stuff, we're going to actually have to reject a lot of aspects of the system itself. That it's not about negotiating with an unjust system. It's actually about saying no to it and instituting a new pathway. And to do that, you actually have to not only resist, but you have to revolt against it. And that's, in a lot of ways, not in a lot of ways, it's truly part of our DNA. I mean, that's how we've moved through time in this country. When the injustices have become so egregious that people no longer are going to stand for it, they rejected it. And part of that component has always been about going up against the current construct of law, in a lot of ways breaking the law in order to change the law. I mean, if you think about the civil rights era, a lot of the stuff that we remember of it, and I think, applaud, are really the moments of which people refused to live under unjust law. Mm-hmm. In order to change that law.
And so like Rosa Parks sitting on the bus, she just said, no, not doing it.
Yeah. So these communities saying, we don't want your frack injection wastewater, are, basically sitting, on the bus saying, no more. We can't stand it anymore. We won't stand it anymore. And you need to stop. But doing it in some ways in a higher level of sophistication, because people are drafting laws. They're basically controlling their own governments and turning those governments up against governments that want to actually not only deny, but, sacrifice those communities on behalf of commercial pursuit. And to be damned if you try to get in the way, kind of thing. And again, you're starting to have communities that realize that if we continue to play that game or be part of that game or be subjected to it, we know what the outcome is going to be. We have decades worth of data now to show where we're heading environmentally or economically or civilly. We aren't going to stand anymore for that. We're going to stand on very different principles. And, back to what we were talking about earlier, really standing on this notion that we are self-governing, that governments are supposed to be founded on the protection of rights, and that basic rights such as, clean air and clean water and rights to a healthy environment and, rights to make an adequate living, for instance, whatever it may be, that, that's the purpose of what our communities need to be set up for. That's what governments should be advocating for. And that if we're going to have a commercial sector out there that's part of that, well, that needs to be its purpose in the sense of what it actually aims to achieve, not to make sure that, a small handful of people continue to line their pockets with more and more wealth at the peril of other, the mass majority of people out there, as well as the environment itself.
Well, I have a question to ask you, because I get this asked all the time. If it's really that, like a lot of these perpetrators, and that's what I call them, as environmental perpetrators, their children are going to be exposed to these negative effects, like this Nuclear Waste Policy Act. This got actually passed out of the committee with the vote of not just Republicans, but Democrats, which lets you know it's not like a party issue. But the question is, they live in states where this nuclear waste is going to be dumped, period. And if people ask me, well, if it was that bad, why would they vote for it? So, in your logic of stuff, what do you respond to that? Because it's going to harm them too.
Exactly. It's sort of, we often, when people start, to kind of stand up and they're sort of looking at their situations and, and realizing how deep and complex, the reality of changing what is going to be, it's natural for people to go, oh man, maybe I should just find someplace else. as if, there is a someplace else. But I think those kind of, I think those kind of people, there's going to be a wake-up call at some point, that there is no place, to insulate yourself from, especially, on things related to large level, energy production, and all the things that come with doing that in a harmful and sustainable way. It's not as if it's not already affecting them, but, think about cancer rates, for instance.
Right.
It's very clear that human activity is, the largest contributor to cancer. Yet there's this disconnect, that, well, perhaps we should stop the things that are causing the cancer. The usual course where people go then is, well, let's invest more into the research of cancer. Well, that's all good and fine for the cancers that, are more clearly understood to be something that aren't human caused. But it's a whole other ballgame when so much of where cancer comes from is coming from our own harmful human activity. But yeah, there continues to be this disconnect, of course, with the policymakers, who again are heavily influenced by those who are interested in industry commercial pursuits. And, they don't put one and one together, but, if they're not already on the fringe of being exposed to their bad decisions, they're going to be at some point. And yeah, it's just crazy making to think you're going to make this decision that, is very clearly going to affect, if not you, your children, and if not them, at least their children. So at some point, you're going to be in the midst of this. So yeah, why are you making such, bad choices around the future? It's a crazy world.
I mean, there really isn't an answer as to why they're doing it, except that they believe in magical thinking. That's what I say. It's like they believe that they're going to, like Dr. Weinberg said in 1972, they considered themselves a nuclear priesthood, and they believe that they're going to come up with a solution eventually. So don't worry about the problems we see now, because we're going to fix it in the future. Like it's magical thinking.
No, there's exactly. I think there's definitely a technology component. There's also belief that's been perpetuated that, commercial pursuits, generate other sort of societal goods. I think there's also the notion of which, folks even like Madison put forward that, you have that opulent minority that needs to have decision-making power over the majority. And I think that is, in my view, still perpetuated especially at the levels of the federal government.
Oh, yeah.
When those elected officials get in there, they believe that they have the answers. So, let them do their job, basically, because, again, they're the opulent minority. And, of course, we see what sort of dangers that comes from that kind of environment and that kind of mode of thinking. You continue to have decisions being made in what you just described. So, again, I think that all feeds into that this is a systems problem. And without actually changing the system, you have no real chance of changing the thinking, changing the behavior, and changing the culture. I mean, really, ultimately what it comes down to is not so much a legal constitutional revolution, even though I think that's a key part of it. It's really about how do you feed into a cultural revolution, one of which really, generates a system of which lives holistically with the planet and all the various ecosystems that give us the ability to live. And of course, how do you set up a system that's more just and interdependent on one another as people? And I believe if we want that, which I think most people do, if not everybody, well, we're not going to get there through the current construct, because the current construct really has no great interest in that. It's been forced to think about those things here and there. It's been forced to sort of try to deal with those kinds of social issues. It's been forced at times to sort of evolve in our belief around certain rights. But all in all, it really lacks the capability to really get to where we really need to go, which means perhaps we need a new document, a new guiding document of sorts, whether that's a federal constitution or whatever it's going to be, but we need a new plan for ourselves. So I think we've done all we can with what was currently laid out. Perhaps we need to think about, creating something new. And that's
instead of like
of,
keep amending what we have, you mean, instead of like
yeah,
changing like we're going to modify it, but instead of doing that, just say, okay, let's just start over.
It's almost like it's almost having like, a rickety old car, and you keep, you keep just, getting the duct tape out or the baling wire or whatever it is, and you keep just sort of letting it chug down the road, when you know full well that it's not capable of doing what you really need it to do, nor is it going to last. So at some point you have to just be done doing the patchwork stuff, and have to begin to think anew. Doesn't mean you can't save some of the elements of what is, but some of the deeper stuff really needs to be reimagined and put forward. But I think the only way that's ever going to come to be is everyday people, doing the hard work, making it happen, and building enough of a real movement that there is no way of which, if you're going to have elected representatives, that their job becomes nothing more than to make sure that the people's constitution, or whatever you want to call it, gets put together. Because right now it's easy enough for them in so many ways to just ignore or give short shrift to really the people's voice, because they have a system which really kind of set up not to do much of that, and to then again give favoritism towards the economic engines, which are corporations. So again, until you get that main charge rewritten, it's going to be awfully difficult, I think, to get to where we want to go, because you're asking something of that system of which it was never intended to do in the first place.
Okay, so now I have two questions for you. The first is, does CELDF, your organization, actually have like a draft of what we think we ought to have?
Well, there are the beginnings of both what amendments or changes, at least initially, to state constitutions could look like, as well as a federal change. These are sort of first wave, I think, examples of, in my mind, getting people to understand that we have to come up with really a different course for ourselves and something radical. And I don't mean radical in a crazy way. I mean radical in the sense of the realization of, the sinking ship we're on, radical. Mm-hmm. And so there are examples. If you were to go to the National Community Rights Network, so that organization is made up by the active community rights states, who all have state community rights networks. That National Community Rights Network has put forward a couple drafts of federal constitutional amendments. And again, I think these are meant to be examples of some significant changes to how government is structured and how government is ordered. I think also it should open up the question of, well, perhaps we need to dig deeper into other aspects of the Constitution, let's say, itself. But yeah, people can go to the National Community Rights Network website and kind of see what that language could look like, both in the sense of that self-governance power, but also things about looking at the environment itself. We have a system of law, not just here in the United States, but really globally, that continues to want to see nature as purely as property, as a thing, as a resource for human consumption. And so we've disregarded, through law at least, the sense that there are other living organisms on this planet, which of course, if we would ask that question outside of the legal realm, people would say, of course trees are living, of course, birds are alive, of course plants are living organisms. There'd be no question. But we have a system of law that really doesn't see any of those things really as living organisms. They see them as objects.
Right.
And so we've structured a system of law that deals with those objects. And in large degree, not completely, I mean, there are exceptions, but in large degree, even environmental protection laws really operate less so to protect those organisms for their own, health, safety, and welfare, let's say, their own ability to persist and flourish, and more so just so that that resource is conserved for the sake of human benefit. It's less about the other organisms and more about making sure that they stick around so that we can have access to them and in a lot of ways continue to destroy them, more so than protecting them in the way that we should be. So what has begun to happen through the community rights work, and interestingly enough is popping up in other ways, is really the shift in seeing the rest of the world or ecosystems really, or other natural communities really as having rights, and that we have to protect them from a rights-based standpoint. And so communities are actually driving that into law in this country at the community level. We've seen that happen in the country of Ecuador at the federal constitutional level. And then lately, we're starting to see even courts at the high level in places like India and Colombia and New Zealand beginning to look at various ecosystems as being rights-bearing, and that there is a need to actually recognize those rights and protect those ecosystems from that standpoint. So that's another big piece of the shift of what's happening, that cultural shift that's also being driven into law and constitutional structures, is to actually look at making sure that those ecosystems, really the planet itself, is protected in a much different way than the law allows for today. And so I think that's another big important piece of which, again, communities in this country are beginning really at the leading edge of, I should say. Which also just one other piece on that front. It sounds sort of strange, but we are starting to work with a number of Native American tribes who are looking at rights of nature for their tribal constitutions. So, I mean, the idea of rights of nature really in function is not a white person creation. Of course, it's an indigenous, way of being. There was no other way but, obviously to live holistically and as part of nature. But understandably, there's been this apprehension of looking at Western law as some means of actually actuating that kind of sensibility. But for whatever reason, that has started to shift. So, tribes like the Ho-Chunk tribe in Wisconsin looking at adopting or have adopted or begun the process of adopting rights of nature into the tribal constitution, and other tribes in the upper Midwest and some in the Southwest, looking to do the same. So there's movement happening in that realm, because just like communities, so many of the tribal lands are subjected to all kinds of environmental harms, with very little to no recourse. I mean, we occasionally hear the winds of, tribal fishing rights being upheld, but those things are very few and far between. Mm-hmm. And in addition, a lot of that stuff is still about, again, human consumption and less about really protecting the planet and the things that we love for the sake of protecting them, as we would a child, for instance.
Acknowledging its right to exist, right?
Yeah. So
we have about 10 minutes, and I want to talk to you about what your organization, I'm on the organizing support page. Mm-hmm. There's a list of like 9 things that you guys do. And I think this is really, now, our listeners are all around the world and in the country, right? So if somebody wanted to get engaged and said, wow, this makes a lot of sense, what's the first step? Somebody who has got like here in Eugene, I'm really lucky. We already have a community rights organizing scene going on. And I've just recently gotten engaged in, since I went to your class, with these folks that brought it here. But what can people do around the country? Who do they contact? And we just have a few minutes left, but I'd like you to spend some time explaining to people who want to take action how they can take action.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think that's obviously, the chance of things going in the way that we've just been talking about for the last little while only happens when people take action. So I think practically speaking, the easiest way is to just spend some time on our website. So if people have access to the web, going to celdf.org. From there, if you live in a community here in the United States, or if you're living in another country even, the easiest thing would be to either, pick up the phone or send an email in to us and explaining where you're at and what's going on, what your situation may be. I mean, in large degree, our way we get activated is something is happening in some place. So whether it's, Lane County with people's desire to rise up to say no to aerial spraying of pesticides, for instance, or whether you're in Grant Township, Pennsylvania, looking to stop injection wells from coming in with toxic wastewater from the fracking industry, there's usually something happening of which people, are saying no more to. And that happens as well internationally. So I think it's about explaining what's going on, through a phone call or an email. And then from there, it's, the general course is us connecting with an individual or a group, whatever it may be, and sort of talking through the situation of what is happening and what they can expect if they choose to embark on this kind of work, which usually means educational stuff like the democracy school that you went through, lots of initial conversations. And then from there, a lot of just organizing support from our end, because often it's people who haven't really been active before that are wanting to get active. And if you are an active group, just, bringing in the context of what has been happening in other places. So that kind of information sharing to evolve the organizing more quickly and thoroughly because of the work that's come before. And then usually involved in that is also communities stepping forward to say, well, we want to say no to something or even yes to something, and working with those folks to draft, the law for their community. So it's really the whole level of this stuff, whether that's the education work, the organizing work, the lawmaking work. It's really about empowering people to understand that they are decision makers, that they've already had and always had that capability. It's just the system has done a very good job of sort of, pushing that away and deep inside us. And I think it's about resurrecting that and getting people together to understand that if we want to shift things and change things, it's going to be us. And our mission, I suppose, as an organization is to help communities get there. That it's really up to the people to do the hard work, but we're there to help educate and inform and guide to a certain degree, but really in large degree be there as a support mechanism as communities need it. And I think that is also how we build the strong roots that are needed for an actual movement at some point. Because without that, it's, you're never going to get there. And two, it's always vulnerable if it's one organization somehow, doing all the work. It's just not going to happen. So, the building out of all the community stuff and the communities themselves becoming stronger and stronger as they move along. And a lot of the strength comes by the action stuff as well as the circumstances that communities have to go through, basically the hardships. And when they get through those hardships and they stick with it, they come out even stronger on the other end, which not only benefits them, but other communities coming up in the ranks. And the great thing I think about what's moved and propelled this work is not any sort of, grand sophisticated analysis of how the system functions or, some marvelous strategic plan of where to go and coming up with clever tactics. It's really just kind of boiled down to, well, we're done with it. We're sick and tired of it. We're not going to stand for it anymore. And, damn it, if we do it, maybe someone else will do it. And if they do it, then perhaps someone else will do it. And I think that's really, the grit of what's sort of built things to this point. And I think that continues to be what the greatest potential is for building it in the future. And as, again, communities make the stands in the way they've been doing, that becomes inspiring to others. But ideally, that inspiration doesn't just sit there as in the sense of just, spectating, but actually put people into action as to your question earlier. So I think it's, getting some information and then taking the step to make contact and then seeing what possibilities there are to actually build the organizing on the ground in the community that you're at, or even in the country that you're at. That's really how things get moving.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that I hear often is like, since Occupy, nobody really wants to get involved because there was a lot of movement in Occupy. It was a lot of it's kind of like those protests right after Trump came in office, right? We had tens of thousands of people in the street, and then it was like a big hot air that just got popped right afterwards, and it just dissipated and nothing happened. Only disgruntlement. Like, people are comfortable being disgruntled, but the key is, how do we, I guess the only way we're going to incite them to actually move from being disgruntled to taking action is for one individual, like a domino peg, right? Just one does it, and then the next one does it, and then the next one does it. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's probably not, I think that's correct. In a weird way, it's, what's going to compel you? And unfortunately, I think most people in most communities, unfortunately, aren't really compelled to really dig in until the crisis is right in your face. We're still, in some strange ways, strange to say it, but we're still somewhat removed. And I think you're right. We've kind of been lulled into thinking we can kind of sit there and sort of yell and point fingers and expect, again, our elected officials to do our bidding for us. And we don't go further than that. So I think back to what we talked about at the beginning of the conversation here is we got to go further. And part of going further is, well, we have to do the work. It's not going to happen because we insist or write letters and demand or protest every so often in large numbers. I mean, that's all good and fine to sort of stir things up, but you got to have something of deeper substance to come back to and work from.
And the work that you mean is by getting signatures, getting community rights, asserting our community rights, actually declaring them and asserting them, and changing the law, getting our constitutional rights back.
Yeah, I think in the context of this work, which I think is one of the critical pieces needed, it's not to say that's the only thing, but yes, I think it's about people realizing that they have to actually take the reins here. We keep thinking that if we make just enough noise, that somehow the system is going to slap itself in the forehead and apologize for all that it's done wrong. And I think that's, I think, in part why you saw the Occupy movement go away. It's why things have fizzled out since people's I guess disgust and problems with how the presidential election went. Because I think there's still this sort of sense that the system can kind of be tweaked, or that can be reformed. I think we need to get over that notion, and then two, once we do, then the understanding is, well, we've got to do the work. Those folks aren't going to do the work. At best, they find ways to relieve the pressure valve, but they don't really go deep into what we really need and deserve and want. They just find ways to relieve the pressure. And the system is very good at relieving the pressure. Well,
Kai, I have to jump in here. We have about 15 seconds left. I hope that we can reschedule and have you back on, because I think we've just barely scratched the surface. Thank you for calling us.
Thank you.
And put your courage feet on, you guys. I'll put some links. I'm going to probably put it in the comments, but talk to you guys tomorrow.